there has been every opportunity to end Julian's suffering, to let him be free, because he has to be free. He should be free. Everyone knows it. Process is being used to hide atrocity, and we know that's from history, that can be done. And the UK should not be doing that. It should not be engaging in persecution on behalf of a foreign power that is out for revenge. That foreign power that committed crimes which Julian put into the sunlight. Specific, concrete crimes that have not been prosecuted, that have been just shoved under the rug. And Julian, who has done nothing wrong, he has done everything that any self-respecting journalist should do when given evidence of a state committing crimes, of corruption. They publish it because their duty is to the public. And Julian's duty to the public has landed him in prison for already more than 3 years, and he faces 175 years. We're not at the end of the road here. We're going to fight this. We're going to use every appeal avenue, and we're going to fight. I'm going to spend every waking hour fighting for Julian until he's free, until justice is served.
So that's Stella Assange there speaking earlier today. So you do wonder, do you, whether it's eventually he is going to have to go to the United States, Martin, when this whole process, and in a way, I hate to say it, but, you know, wouldn't it be better for this whole thing to be over, because it's just such a horrific thing for the people to do to him? Is there any chance that you think of him coming out of this?
Well, there's a new Labour government in Australia, and I understand that Albanese, the guy in charge, is on the record as saying that this has got to stop, and he is an Australian citizen. Now, he may be able to put some pressure on and say, well, you know, this deal that we did, or the previous government did, about these nuclear submarines, well, you release Julian or we're going to cancel it. What about that?
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of where this leaves other journalists, what do you think? Because it's bound to have a big effect, isn't it?
Oh, it's already had a big effect. You know, this is the point of this. Don't forget that a lot of this material was actually published in The Guardian and Der Spiegel and the New York Times. They're not being prosecuted. He's being prosecuted. And that is because they're trying to distinguish between what they regard as journalism, you know, the sort of thing that we pay for, and others.
I think it's nice. It's nice to contrast.
We're not journalists.
I think it's very useful to contrast this with this Anna Lipp, the German journalist, as well, because she is just literally being given the same sort of treatment. The first thing that the German authorities have done is to freeze her bank accounts. They opened a criminal case against her and froze her and her father's bank account, pending a trial. She's forbidden to appear at over her reporting of Russia's military operation. You know, this is unbelievable, isn't it? So not only is her account frozen, it makes you think that you maybe shouldn't bother with a bank account if it could be frozen at any time.
Well, then it makes it difficult for you to do your job, which is the whole point. You know, a lot of harassment.
Well, maybe a Russian bank account.
Well, maybe. There's probably ways round, but all of this harassment has its effect.
You know what? This reminds me of the seizure of money by the Western authorities of the Russian money in the Western bank accounts. The idea is, if they're going to start to use seizure of bank accounts as a way to try and shut down people, control people they don't like, then obviously people are going to start moving their money around the world.
Well, that's right. I mean, ultimately, I hope that all of this is going to be self-defeating, because you make yourself look culpable when you try to cover up people investigating your lies.
I suppose their hope is,
but of course they do it because it works.
Well, their hope is that the press won't cover this. Well, that's what they do. That they can shut people like this German journalist Anna Lipp's bank account, and her father, unbelievably, even though he apparently hasn't actually done anything wrong. He's not supposed to be a Russian spy, but he might give money to her. So let's close his bank account too. The idea is that we can do this without any reporting of it, and this is on This isn't on one of the mainstream websites. This is on something called yournews.com. This stuff this week about Anna. And so, in a way, actually, the mainstream press have simply gone along with this and covering this story up.
I very much doubt that. What the mainstream press do is they take press releasings from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence and just, publish them. They certainly don't go out to the front line to ask people what's going on. That's not what they do at all. And the other thing that happens, of course, to journalists in Colombia, for example, a lot, is they just have nasty accidents, car accidents, robberies.
Accidents can happen.
That's the one.
The New White Rose of Germany, she's called, Anna Lipp. Anyway, so I'll put links up to the articles about Anna and obviously about Julian and just the general attack on the truth, which is what this is, and about free press, even though at the same time, of course, they're moaning at the Saudis for assassinating Khashoggi, the journalist.
They're not moaning that much.
No?
No.
They're still doing deals with them, buying oil from them.
Our military personnel are still embedded in Saudi Arabia, repressing and killing the people of Yemen.
So, yes, so a pretty comprehensive look at press freedom there, I hope. One of the things, of course, another thing that hasn't been covered is this Bilderberg conference. Happened roughly 2 weeks ago now, but we covered it with Charlie Skelton last week and in various other ways. And I noticed an enterprising chap called Josh Friedman turned up at the airport in Washington and was wishing goodbye to various of the Bilderberg attendees who were catching their planes back to Austria. And there's a guy called Andreas Treichl, and another one. This was the guy they spoke to. He runs one of the big banks in Austria. He was over at Bilderberg, and talking of banks, shutting people's bank accounts down. This is the sort of guy that does that kind of thing. A little bit power crazy, you might say. So here's Josh Friedman collaring Andreas Treichl at the Washington airport just after the Bilderberg conference, Bilderberg 2022, the Sunday before last.
Mr. Treichl, what about the disruptions to the global financial system? That was a key topic this year.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
How bad?
It's pretty bad. It's a serious situation, and we have to be extremely careful that the people in Europe don't suffer from that.
And was there any consensus at the meeting about what could be done so people don't suffer?
We're not talking about that. It's a private meeting.
So he says there at the end, he says, was there any consensus at Bilderberg about this? He says, we're not talking about that. It's a private meeting. Maybe he doesn't quite understand Chatham House rules. You can talk about what was discussed at Bilderberg, but you're not allowed to name who told you it, especially if it's Henry Kissinger.
Well, that may be so, and it may be that that there is no consensus. I can imagine that there was probably quite a lot of.
Anyway, he's using the words "serious situation," referring to the coming global financial disruption.
Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but the Federal Reserve's increased the base interest rate in the US for the highest level in one go in 30 years. And that's rather stolen the thunder of the Bank of England's increase in interest rates, and stock markets have started to take fright. And as the sanctions on Russia begin to bite on Europe, because that's where the blow is going to fall, the European economies could slide. Britain is sliding into recession. Looks like we're sliding in first because we've got particular problems. And then the banking system will collapse as it did in 2008.
It didn't collapse in 2008.
Well, it didn't collapse because they bailed it out, but they can't bail it out again.
Maybe they can. They could just
make
up some more
money.
If
they were going to bail it out again, they'd have kept interest rates at zero.
Oh.
Right. Yeah. Well, so in actual fact, they've decided not to bail it out again.
Maybe they could bail it out.
No, you can't do that by increasing interest rates. You could try and drive into the crash by keeping interest rates low and increasing public expenditure. But the danger of that is that you would get hyperinflation. So that they don't want to do that, and that means in actual fact you're going to get a crash, because you shouldn't be driving at this speed. We shouldn't have been. All the policies pursued since 2008 were the wrong policies. And at a certain point, you've got to reverse them.
It wasn't a crash, was it? It was a bailout. Let's just make that
but it wasn't.
I keep hearing people.
Yes, I know, but when you say it wasn't a crash, millions of people in the United States, just in the United States, lost their jobs and their homes. For them, it was a crash. It wasn't a crash for Wall Street, but for ordinary people, it was a disaster. So what you're actually talking about is that bailing them out, bailed them out. It didn't bail everybody else out. We're still living with much reduced living standards for ordinary people all over the world as a result of the last crash. And it's going to be worse this time. And that crash is going to hurt ordinary people. They will survive.
Now, I've got a little bee in my bonnet about something called the RTFO, which no one's heard of. Called the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation. Now, this is an increase in fuel prices that happened on the 1st of January this year. It's a carbon offset tax, part of the COP26 and whatever they are, 25, 24. And 20 pence extra is quite a lot on fuel. So, but I looked at the fuel prices over that time, and actually over the Christmas and New Year period, there was no great leap of 20 pence in the fuel. So what the oil companies were doing was they actually absorbed that into their own when the fuel price went up, when they were having to pay more in tax for the fuel, and so nobody really noticed that that this tax had gone up in 20 pence. If you actually sit and think about it, that's a 15% increase in the price of fuel over Christmas. And of course, over a couple of months after Christmas, then they started to ramp up the price of fuel. But nobody really associated it with this renewable transport fuel obligation. Anyway, so this could be one of the main sources of the inflation we've seen this year, couldn't it? 15% increase in price of fuel.
But it's only in Britain.
Inflation in the UK.
Yes, that's what I mean. But the inflation is actually taking hold in the global economy because of supply constraints and also because of the mismanagement.
Well, I don't think so. I think that the fuel has a massive input. If you're putting fuel prices up, as they've done in this country, roughly 20% over the last 3 or 4 months. No, since the August, September, autumn 2021. That has a massive knock-on effect on everything, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
I was just...
It does, but if you look around the world...
7View Services this week, and I was chatting to one of the lorry drivers there. He says now it's costing about £800 to fill up a lorry.
Yes, and all over the world, in the US, they've got much, much lower fuel prices than we have. But their economy is totally dependent on those low fuel prices. So if it just rises a little bit, their economy starts to fall down the drain. Other countries, like Venezuela, have got very low fuel prices because they produce oil, but they then subsidise it to the ordinary people.
This is the end of socialism in oil, because Michael Hudson talked about things like this infrastructure. Yes. The stuff we need to go... needs to be provided at cost. It clearly isn't being. No. It's being given this green tax. Apparently you're offsetting all the nasty carbon now by paying this extra 20 pence a litre.
The obvious thing to do is cut the Gordian knot in a socialist fashion and nationalise all energy production. And then, of course, you can make a plan for what you want to do. But, of course, we've got the delusion that this is all private sector and we can't touch that, which is totally wrong. It's not. I mean, Statoil in Norway is a classic, it's just across the North Sea there. They own their own oil industry. The Russians own their own oil industry, so they can use it as part of a global battle against the global capitalists who they're up against.
We own quite a lot of our own railway network at the moment, but that's for later on. We'll be talking about the RMT strike in a little while. Sticking with the economics, all of this, one of my favourite commentators on the economy is a guy called King Mervyn. Of course, his actual real name is Mervyn King. He's former Bank of England governor, and he is warning right now of what he says, a very unpleasant period ahead, rather like the Bilderbergers were saying.
Well, a mistake is to believe that you can make accurate forecasts. I mean, economists on the 1st of January each year tend to make forecasts. They're always wrong, but there are good reasons why. Stuff happens. 1st of January 2020, all the economic forecasts published then, you could have torn up a few weeks later with the pandemic. 2021, at the beginning of the year, people were trying to forecast how quickly the economy would come back. We had a second wave. Forecasts again didn't make much sense. 1st of January 2022, no one forecast the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They didn't build it into their economic forecast. So these forecasts are always going to be wrong. The more important thing to do is not to pretend that we know that inflation is going to be 3.2% in a particular year, but we try to identify the risks. What are the risks on the upside and the downside? What actions can we take to mitigate those risks? That's what policy is really all about. And if you think about the risks today, the risks are firmly, I think, on the side of inflation becoming more ingrained into the system because we keep talking about it, we expect it to happen, and we adjust our wage demands and our price setting decisions accordingly. And it's very important to try and get back to a world in which we thankfully stop talking about inflation once more.
Is it significant or relevant that this has begun with energy? I mean, does energy play a particular role? A lot of economists kind of almost try not to think about it, just treat it as an input. But is there a significance to the fact that there's, we've got very high energy costs, and does that make it kind of somewhat different, somewhat faster to previous recessions?
Well, I think there are two ways in which it is different. The first one is that it clearly impacts different people in different ways, and it hurts particularly people on low incomes because you cannot change your heating system. You can't just say, oh, gas has gone up in price, maybe I'll switch to it, heat pump or something. You can't do that at all quickly. So you're stuck with it. There's no real action, and these terrible stories of people just switching off the heating illustrate the only course of action they can take. So it affects the welfare of people on low incomes significantly. I think the second is a wider reflection of the same problem. But the real issue here is that we don't produce all the energy ourselves. So we have to import quite a lot. And that means that when energy prices go up, it's a bit like the rest of the world imposing a tax on us as a country. So as a country, we're worse off, and there's nothing we can do about that. That makes it much, much harder to provide help and support for those who are hardest hit, because it's going to double down on the hit on people on average incomes or on better off incomes. And there just aren't enough very rich people to tap, to make transfer to keep the rest of us from suffering too much. Everyone basically takes a hit when energy prices go up, and we can talk about how to make it, to help people on low incomes. But the idea that there is any way which as a country we can avoid this problem isn't true when it comes to energy.
So, yes, when it comes to energy, apparently their hands are tied, Martin.
Well, every buyer has a seller. The energy producers, the corporations you were talking about earlier, they're in a very strong position in this situation, as are countries which have significant oil supplies.
Well, Britain does have oil supplies.
Not enough.
Not
That's
enough,
why we
no.
have to import. The Russians don't have to import. We do.
Right. So gas and oil, these forms of energy, really, if it's not in state hands, surely the whole point here is that they can just price fix. They can actually control the market themselves.
Well, in the past, the Seven Sisters, which were the Western oil companies, they dominated the policy of the Western governments. So, we participated in the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran in 1954 because they nationalised British Petroleum, which was in fact owned by the British government, but of course subsequently became an independent private. I mean, this idea of having, Hudson's very good on all of this. These companies are natural monopolies. There's no real competition. The spot market, which has been used to try and, the Poles, for example, decided they didn't want cheap Russian energy at agreed prices, and they wanted to go to the international market, so they went to court in London to get out of the contracts they'd signed with the Russians, and then of course they had to go to the spot markets just as the price went through the roof. And of course futures markets in energy mean that a barrel of oil on a futures market can be way, way above the actual market price on the day that you want to buy it. So it's the private ownership of this infrastructure, coupled with speculative futures markets, mean that you're incredibly vulnerable.
Andrew
and
Bailey,
that's why governments used to control this stuff, because they knew it's the means of making war for a start. The whole battle in the Eastern Front in World War II partly was to control the oil fields in the Caucasus, and if the Germans had concentrated on that, they might have won.
Andrew Bailey's the current governor of the Bank of England. You just heard from Mervyn King, the previous governor, before Mark Carney, who, of course, was at Bilderberg weekend before last. He talks about the apocalyptic... He issued an apocalyptic warning over food prices, didn't he, a few weeks ago? 16th of May, in fact. This is a bit of a... Well, it's an interesting word he used. Apocalyptic is not like...
well, this is the mainstream covering their backside for when we get the crash, which may be before the end of the year. And they'll say, well, we did predict it. I mean, as the Queen famously said in 2008, why didn't anybody predict this? And, of course, the mainstream economists just had to cough and shuffle because they hadn't predicted it. But, of course, plenty of economists like Hudson had predicted it. It's just that they don't have any influence. It's pretty clear what's going to happen here. There is going to be a crash of the everything bubble, and there's pretty good consensus about this from both left-wing and right-wing
someone
economists.
That should know what's going on is a guy called Jamie Dimon. He's chairman of the board and the chief executive officer of JP Morgan Chase & Company, global financial services firm, with assets of roughly $3.2 trillion. And worldwide operations. They often turn up at the Bilderberg conferences too, funnily enough. But he had some interesting things to say, a similar theme where he's talking, I think it's, he's basically now screaming like that apparently there's going to be some sort of economic collapse. So let's have a listen to Jamie Dimon on the Unseen interview a couple of weeks ago.
You mentioned storm clouds.
Yeah, I'm going to change the storm clouds because I said there are three things that we're going through, which are, I hate the word unprecedented, which are kind of unprecedented. And you got to put this in back of your mind. When you've seen things that have never happened before, then you have to question your ability to predict, okay? One is huge growth in this country driven by fiscal and monetary stimulation. That isn't a normal recovery. Okay, and that fiscal stimulation is still in the pocketbooks of consumers. They're spending it. They're spending at very strong levels. And the data is completely distorted. It's distorted by inflation. It's distorted by, they went from goods back to services. It's distorted by all these things. But jobs are plentiful. Wages are going up. Consumers are spending. The lower income folks, not quite as much as before. But everybody else, it looks like they have $2 trillion more. Savings rate drop. I don't think that's going to stop the spending in 6 or 9 months. So that to me is the bright clouds out there. But it's different. The Fed has to meet this now with raising rates and QT. And the new part of this isn't the raising rates, it's the QT. The QT we've never had QE before like this. Therefore, we've never had QT like this. So you're looking at something they're going to be writing history books on for 50 years. What was QE? What worked? What didn't work? I think a lot of parts of QE backfired. I think the negative rates was probably a huge mistake for a whole bunch of different reasons I won't bore you with now. But they got to raise rates, and in my view, they have to do QT. They do not have a choice because there's so much liquidity in the system. They have to remove some of the liquidity to stop the speculation, to reduce home prices, stuff like that. And you've never been through QT. So all the major buyers, if you go back to 2010 and say, who are all the major buyers of treasuries? All that time, it was central banks, foreign exchange managers, banks who were topping up their liquidity profiles because we had to for regulations. All three, it won't happen the go round. Banks are topped up, foreign exchange managers are topped up, the central bank will be selling, not buying, and governments have much more fiscal deficit to finance. That's a huge change in the flow of funds around the world. I don't know what the effect of that is. I'm prepared for, I can tell you a minimum huge volatility. And the third thing is Ukraine. That you've not had a European land war since 1945, okay? And the complexity of Ukraine is we don't know the outcome. I always make a list, if you predict the outcome. Well, you couldn't predict the outcome of Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, 10 other conflagrations. All wrong. Wars go bad. They go south. They have unintended consequences. And this happens to be roiling the commodity markets of the world. Wheat, oil, gas, and stuff like that, which in my view will continue. We're not taking the proper actions to protect Europe from what's going to happen in oil in the short run, and we're not taking the proper actions to protect you all what's going to happen to oil in the next 5 years, which means it almost has to go up the price. We're not investing enough money to keep oil a number. And for all those who love climate change, if oil prices go to 175 or 150, which I kind of think is in the cards, to tell you the truth, not in the immediate run, but down the road, then CO2 won't go down, which is everyone predicts, because people buy less oil and gas. It's going to go up because all those other countries out there, the poor countries who need oil and gas to feed and heat their citizens, will not buy oil and gas, they'll buy coal. That's what's going to happen. CO2 will go up, it won't come down. And we're not dealing with these challenges. So those three things, fiscally induced growth, QT, Ukraine war. Look, I'm an optimist. I said there's storm clouds, they're big storm clouds, it's a hurricane. Right now it's kind of sunny, things are doing fine. Everyone thinks the Fed can handle this. That hurricane is right out there down the road coming our way. We just don't know if it's a minor one or Superstorm Sandy Sandy or Andrew or something like that. And you better brace yourself. So JP Morgan's bracing ourselves, and we're going to be very conservative in our balance sheet on, with all this capital uncertainty. We're going to have to take actions, and I kind of want to shed non-operating deposits again, which we can do in size, to protect ourselves so we can serve clients in bad times. And so that's the environment we're dealing with. And I think it's okay to hope that'll end up okay. I hope it. That's my Goldilocks. I hope. Who the hell knows?
Who the hell knows, Martin? So he's saying there's lots of these ingredients in the equations now which are unknowns. And this QT he's talking about is everyone's heard of QE, quantitative easing, which was printing money, but QT is quantitative tightening.
That's right.
So this is just basically
well, if you remember a few years ago, there was something called the taper tantrum, where the Federal Reserve said they
wanted to taper QE.
Yes, they wanted to taper QE because they're basically, the financial markets have become addicted to financial heroin, which is all the free money that you're talking about. And of course, as soon as they perceived that they weren't getting the heroin that they'd been used to, they immediately started to collapse. So they then had to go back to giving them the same heroin.
There's something a bit messed up.
But now we're going to go for cold turkey, which of course is going to mean the crashes in the stock market. It's the obvious. When he talks about the Ukraine war, he hasn't mentioned the main problem with the Ukraine war, which is the Western sanctions on Russia. That's totally self-inflicted. The West didn't have to do that, but by doing that, they really. The financial people have, like Dimon, have been rather excluded from the decisions about things like this. So they were saying, well, don't do that because that's going to kill us. But the sort of more political, well, I'm sure we can put sanctions on. I thought it was so fascinating. They haven't really thought it through. The financial people said, well, that's just going to kill us off.
As all these Greens and XR people are rubbing their hands over the price of oil going up and inflation as a result, he's saying there, actually, this is not good. I quite like Jamie Dimon in that, because these people are in charge of such vast sums of money, they've really got to know what's going on. And he's saying, actually, it's going to mean an increase in the use of coal. So don't rub your hands and don't shout and scream and say how wonderful this is.
No. Well, in actual fact, what's going to happen as a result of the inflation, everybody's worried about inflation. It's not in the inflation that's the problem. Inflation eats away at people's capacity. In the past, they used to have wage price spirals. Yeah, because trade unions were strong in this country particularly, and others even more so, and they just bargained for the inflation rate each time they went to bargain. Now what happens when inflation kicks in is poor people can't bargain up their wages, and they just get less money, and then they can't go out and spend as much as they used to. He's talking about his bank is going to be very conservative. He's going to pull in its horns, and we're not going to be doing anything too speculative. But by doing that, that's what brings the crash on. Everybody makes the decision that I'm going to save a bit of money here. That's what I need to do in case there's a crash. And as everybody does that, that is the crash. Because all of the demand drops out of the economy.
The psychology behind it is
fascinating. It's what Keynes called the liquidity trap.